Adrian from Willette's Bakery on Hennepin Avenue, and welcome to Inside Minneapolis.
Welcome to Inside Minneapolis. I'm Phil Lindsay, and on this edition we're going to take a look at the South Hennepin Avenue corridor. In fact, we're right here on Hennepin Avenue, right outside Calhoun Square. We're going to tape this edition of Inside Minneapolis. And on this show we're going to talk about some interesting topics. We're going to talk about streetcars. We're going to talk about preservation and adaptive reuse of buildings. We're going to talk about some strategic planning that some of the neighbors did a few years back. And we're also going to take a look at some of the commercial success people have enjoyed in this part of town. But before we do that, let's get oriented with a map of this part of town. We'll be right back. Now, before we meet our first guest, let's take a look at a clip from an interesting video that talks a little bit about Thomas Lowry and the development of streetcars along this stretch of South Hennepin Avenue. We'll see you inside.
Minneapolis's first electric streetcar made its debut on Christmas Eve, 1889. St. Paul launched its electric car service with car 169 on Grand Avenue in February 1890. More than anyone else, Thomas Lowry was the man responsible for the Twin Cities having one of the finest and most efficient street railway systems in the country. Lowry was a lawyer and real estate dealer. He owned the land that's now known as Lowry Hill in Minneapolis. He was first head of the Minneapolis system and eventually St. Paul's too. Twin City Rapid Transit Company came into being in 1893. By joining the two systems, it was easier to get financing, most of which had to come from the east because local investors were skeptical. By 1893, Minneapolis had 114 miles of streetcar track, St. Paul 96.
Do what you need to do.
Okay, so
I was going to say, we could do the Jerry Springer body language, but I sit there with everything.
Well, what we just saw was a clip from a wonderful video put together by the Minnesota Transportation Museum. It's called One More Ride. And of course, that was just a little snippet and a little bit of background on Thomas Lowry and the earliest development of streetcars here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. With me is a gentleman who knows a whole lot about streetcar development and what streetcars meant to the Twin Cities. Aaron Isaacs, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining me and Inside Minneapolis. You've worn a lot of hats with this organization, and actually there's a family connection, you were telling me. Your dad helped start this thing.
Yeah, my dad's one of the founders of the museum, and I've pretty much grown up with this interest in streetcars and with the museum.
That's right, and you edit their publications, and among other things, you are their photo archivist.
That's correct.
And you have a pretty large collection.
Yeah, the museum has a collection of, I think it's about 4,000 pictures of Minnesota streetcars and electric railways. We also have others of other railways and steamboats and stuff, but the electric railway collection is really kind of special.
That's the heart and soul of the collection.
That's the heart and soul of it, and it's been gathered from people who were collectors over time, from original photos that came from the streetcar company, photos from the Minnesota Historical Society, and I brought some of them here today to show.
Well, great. Tell you what, let's just start right off here. Why don't, if you'll give them to me and I'll hold them to our camera so our viewers can see them, and you can just talk us through this. Now, what are we looking at here, Aaron?
Well, since we're talking about Hennepin Avenue today, this is Hennepin Avenue by Loring Park and the Basilica. You can see the Basilica in the background. This is a newspaper photograph from the Minnesota Historical Society, as are a lot of these. And something bad happened. As a matter of fact, the next picture will show the cause of this backup of streetcars.
In other words, this is unusual to have all these streetcars lined up like this.
Right. There were a lot of streetcars, but not this. You can see people standing alongside saying, what's the problem up there?
Scratching their heads there.
To the left in the photograph is the Plaza Hotel, which sat in the middle of what they call the bottleneck. And that whole area right now is I-94, the open area just north of the Lowry Hill Tunnel.
Okay, and then this next picture, as I understand it,
this is
maybe shows what had happened.
Right.
Up the hill a little bit there. Now,
yeah.
Again, to orient our viewers, this might be just up the Lowry Hill there a bit.
That's correct. Let me just take a quick look. Yeah, so we're looking from about Groveland Avenue north. And on the far left, you can see the old Walker Art Center, kind of a Moorish looking building as it was originally constructed. What has happened with that streetcar, that's where the Hennepin and Lyndale Avenue lines diverge. The front end of the streetcar went down Lyndale and the back end went down Hennepin, and they're trying to sort out how to undo that mess.
And they were quick thinking enough to stop it before it split in two.
That's correct. And so in the background you can see the Plaza Hotel, and then of course Loring Park is on the right and the Basilica way in the distance.
Now you mentioned the Walker. Now this was their first building that was on the edge of this image, and you brought, we may have some graphic difficulty here in getting a great shot on this, but you brought this little tiny picture of what, the next version of the Walker?
Well, they put a different facade on it, and the facade went on in the 40s, maybe it was the early 50s. I know that photo was taken probably about 1951 or 52.
Okay.
And it was to make it more modern. You know, there were lots of buildings that lost their old Victorian type of facades,
right,
or the 1920s facade, because they wanted to make it more up to date.
An architectural trend at that time. So
yeah.
that's a somewhat more updated look at the Walker. And then in the clip we were hearing a little bit about Thomas Lowry, and what you have here now is an image of a statue that still exists as a statue, but not in this location.
Well, when you climb up this hill on Hennepin Avenue, you're climbing Lowry Hill, and as you had mentioned before the show, it was originally called the Devil's Backbone, which is kind of a horrific sounding name, but it became Lowry Hill when Thomas Lowry, who was the founder of the streetcar system and really one of the major civic figures in early Minneapolis,
absolutely,
built his house on the west side of Hennepin Avenue, just south of the Walker where the insurance building is.
And they have that big buffalo sculpture out there, yeah.
That was the site of his house. And that house was there, I think, until the 40s, maybe the 50s. And then in the area right between where Hennepin and Lyndale split, they erected the statue of Thomas Lowry, appropriate Lowry Hill. And this is that statue. And then the streetcar that is coming down the hill on Hennepin. Right. Now, of course, this whole area has been obliterated and is now this maze of freeway ramps.
Exactly.
And the statue has been moved down to 26th and Hennepin in front of Temple Israel Synagogue.
Sure.
Anyway, we're progressing down Hennepin Avenue here. Here's another small one, if you can get it. This was also taken about the late 1940s. But this is looking northbound across the intersection of Franklin and Hennepin. The car is southbound. If you look down the signs on the left, you won't be able to pick this up, but there's Becky's Cafeteria, which anybody who's spent any time... A real landmark, very kind of an eccentric place full of antiques and evangelical literature is what I recall from eating there. The apartment building shown in the photo is still there, but the rest of it beyond it is gone.
Right. This is a nice image.
This is a good one. This is about 1953, and you're looking out the windshield of one streetcar. You're headed northbound on Hennepin, approaching 25th Street, and the large building, the kind of Greek Revival apartment building there, fourplex with the screen porch, is still there. The building just beyond it, the Victorian wood building, is still there, but that's the building that had what was Delaria's Kentucky Fried Chicken. The first Kentucky Fried Chicken in town was a commercial building built onto the front of it. I can't remember what's there now, but there's
still maybe?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And what is now the Super America station is on the right-hand side of the street.
Yep.
And then Tut Hills General Store, if you look on the right-hand side, you can still see the commercial block that houses Tut Hills and houses the Willette Bakery. They used to be Gelpies.
Yes, interesting. And another one here?
Okay, this is the best picture I've seen of the Lake and Hennepin intersection. This is in about 1935. Once again, almost all these photos, except for the small ones, are from the Minnesota Historical Society. The other ones are from the Transportation Museum archive. Here you're standing at approximately where McDonald's is, looking south on Hennepin. And most of the buildings are there. On the left you can see what is now the entrance to Calhoun Square.
Which is where we're sitting right now?
We're sitting right there. On the far right is the Rainbow Building.
Right.
Of course, the largest, most prominent building on the corner did burn down a few years ago, was replaced by the Gap. In the distance on the right is the Suburban World Theater, which I think was called the Granada back then. But a lot of what you see is still there. And of course, you can see how the streetcar just runs down the middle of the street.
And kept the corridor pretty much the same way. Aaron, let's take a break right now and take another look at another clip from One More Ride. This talks a little bit about how the automobile came in and sort of took on the streetcars. So let's take a pause and take a look at a clip from one more ride. We'll be right back.
The only competition the streetcar had when it was horse-drawn in its earliest days was the horse and buggy, and to some extent, bicycles. But it was the automobile that eventually brought about the downfall of the streetcar. It began to hurt streetcar service right after World War I. When Henry Ford started mass-producing his cars, it seemed like everybody wanted his own wheels and didn't need the streetcar the way they had in the past. The streetcar company battled that competition by buying newer and better and bigger streetcars and expanding service. The peak years for the streetcars were 1930 and 1931. On main and heavily used lines, riders could expect to catch a car as often as every 30 seconds during rush hours. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, there were 523 miles of track, 1,021 streetcars operating every day. It was hard to find a place in the area you couldn't get to by streetcar.
Well, Aaron, I thought, having seen that, about how the automobile kind of came in and took on the streetcars, you could talk maybe briefly about what happened to the streetcars here in Minneapolis and along this corridor.
Well, the streetcars, of course, because everyone used them in the early part of the century up through the 1920s. I mean, people in the city, for the most part, didn't have horses, didn't have carriages, didn't have automobiles. If you look at early pictures of the street, you'll see it's like the streetcar and nothing else is on the street.
Right.
And so because of that, the ridership grew to really fantastic levels. 200 and some million people in 1926, I think, was the top year.
That's an amazing figure to me.
Very, very high. The present bus system hauls about 70 million, just to give you a comparison.
On an annual basis?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
And so essentially, if you wanted to go anywhere, you simply walked out to the street, and here came one.
And rapidly, they came so frequently.
Right, they came, they were running once every minute or two. There was always a streetcar in sight, so it was really kind of like a conveyor belt to take you where you wanted to go. Yeah. Transferring was easy. And this lasted through World War II, and at the point where the streetcar system was turned over to different management through a stock proxy fight, and they started to dismantle it. Even as late as that in 1949, there were still 160 million rides. 1/3, I found a study of transportation in Twin Cities. 1 out of every 3 trips in the whole Twin Cities metro area was made on the streetcars or buses. And so it was just a very different era. And then, of course, after World War II in the 50s, the automobile became predominant. The freeways were built that gave a huge travel time advantage to cars, and the system shrank dramatically.
Yeah. Couldn't be profitable anymore.
No, it couldn't have been. There was a point where it just...
We have just a minute left, and very briefly, the Minnesota Transportation Museum, which you're part of, has a number of programs going on, not least of which is the line that runs from Lake Harriet over to Lake Calhoun.
That's
correct. Can you describe that, and then there's some planning going on about maybe extending that?
We have 6 different operating sites, which I'll name real quickly. We have the trolley at Lake Harriet. We have the little depot at Minnehaha Falls Park. We have a railroad in the St. Croix Valley based at Osceola, Wisconsin, that runs down the river to Marine on St. Croix. We're running steam out there on Saturdays this summer. We have the steamboat Minnehaha, which was actually built by the streetcar system over at its shops at 31st and Nicollet and ran on Lake Minnetonka. That's operating. We have a roundhouse building we just opened up over in St. Paul behind the state capitol, and we just opened a second short streetcar line in Excelsior.
Well, you guys are moving. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it just keeps growing.
And there's a possibility of extending the line from Harriet past Lake Harriet?
Right. It's in
past Lake Calhoun?
It's in the Park Board chain of lakes plan to extend it up using the west side of East Calhoun Parkway, up as far as the refectory, and then make a loop there. And then there's an additional plan to cross Lake Street and Lagoon and go up the north side of the mall and end up by the Walker Library. Now, these are in approved plans, but the issue is getting money.
That's right.
There's a possibility of a federal grant application this year to maybe get the money.
Well, Aaron, I wish you the best of luck. Continued good work with the Minnesota Transportation Museum. Thanks for the images. Now, our next guest is going to come in and talk about preservation and some of the adaptive reuse issues. But before that, we're going to take a look at our monthly feature that we call Did You Know? And this one's a wonderful one. Elizabeth, would you bring this image? Thank you very much. Now, what you're looking at is an original photograph of the Calhoun Public School. And take a look at this. We'll put a fact up right next to it.
maybe.
Too bad. Well, we're back. Now, that was a great image, and we want to thank the public schools for that. Calhoun Public School stood from 1887 to 1974, and of course, that's just east of where we are right here, taping this edition of Inside Minneapolis, just east of Calhoun Square. Now, every month we also do a feature called What the Heck Is That? And this month we're going to do Who the Heck Is That? So at this point in the show, we usually call up an image of that, and later in the show, we're going to get some wrong answers as to who the heck this is, and then we'll get the right answer at the end of the show. But I just want to give you a little preview of our Who the Heck feature this month. And for this next segment of Inside Minneapolis, we're going to be talking with Amy Lucas. She is a preservation planner and actually kind of an old friend, an old ally on some of the issues here in terms of preserving the culture of Minneapolis. Amy, it's nice to have you on the show.
Nice to be here.
Thank you. And we're going to talk about preservation, maybe adaptive reuse, and what preservation means to a city, and maybe to some extent in particular this corridor here along South Hennepin. But let's start with some basics. Preservation, what does that mean when you as a planner or the city is asked to think about those issues? What is preservation?
I think a lot of people think it's a nearly defined word, and I try to show people that preservation is education in the city, not just saving the old, but maybe putting new in a community that fits within the character of architecture and design in the city. Preservation in the city that I work for, there are actually 2 preservation planners now in the city, and they staff the Preservation Commission. We're housed in the planning department. So we really get involved in every aspect, whether it's zoning or even kind of building inspection items down to new developments, new housing developments in the
What
city.
does it mean when a building gets designated? You hear that sometimes, that such and such is either up for designation or somebody wants it or somebody maybe doesn't want it. What does that actually mean?
The Preservation Commission that I staff recommends designation of buildings or districts. There are about 120 individually designated buildings, and then there are 9 historic districts in the city. And the City Council is the body that actually designates these buildings, and they can range from the ordinary house to a theater or city hall. It means that the Commission does protect and look at changes to those buildings. They don't stop the changes. I think that's what scares people. They just try to guide the changes, hoping that new additions would fit within the building structure.
And then somehow that's sort of cataloged and archived as part of the texture and the history and the fabric of our community. We're sitting here at Calhoun Square, and this whole show we're talking about South Hennepin Avenue. What's your impression? I'm not asking for specifics right now, but your impression of Hennepin Avenue from down near the bottleneck down to Lakewood Cemetery when you put your preservation and your planning eyeglasses on. What's your impression?
When I first came to the city, I think this is probably one of the most vibrant streets, and it's surprising because we were just talking, the street hasn't changed really since it was constructed, and it developed haphazardly, but that's what makes it vibrant even today. It's great. A lot of these one-story stores may have started out as a grocery. Now they're coffee shops. They don't need more parking than they had originally.
And as you talked about, too, the fact that some of these are maybe 1 or 2 stories with residential above, commercial down below?
And that's still really similar.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of residential offices up above.
Well, and our previous guest mentioned that there'd been a fire at the corner of Hennepin and Lake. One older building went down, and then the Gap came in and built a new building. And it more or less maintained at least what I think of as the cornice line.
Right.
Were they constrained to doing that, or did they just sort of do that of their own volition?
No, Uptown, this is not a historic district, and only a few of these buildings are designated, the theaters. So it's really, I think, that people understand when they come into this area what makes it work, and they try to play off of that.
They want to keep that texture going. Okay. Well, let's take a pause here because our crew, Sherry Nolan, often researches in the archives some wonderful photos. Let's take a look at a montage that she and our crew put together of some wonderful buildings kind of along the Hennepin Avenue stretch, and we'll come back and talk more specifics. Well, now one interesting point to make is that everything we just saw, those buildings still stand. Every single one of them. They might be reused from their original purpose, but they're
Almost
still
all
there.
of them are.
Yeah, is that right? And there are a couple of those that you're familiar with. Let's start at the south end here, down near Lakewood. A couple of those buildings have had some interesting projects.
Well, we were talking about the fire station, and fire stations make for great reuse projects now, especially people like the big open spaces, and that's housing now. And then across the street is the Twin City Granite Works we just saw, and that is now Played Again Sports.
Right.
But when you go in there today, you can see where the hoists were that actually carried the gravestones that they were working on through the building because they were so heavy.
So it goes without saying that that monument company was there because of Lakewood Cemetery.
Right,
And I think
right.
from some research we did, they actually, down the block there, had a significant florist operation as well.
Oh, they did. I remember that. That building.
Yeah. Hennepin Avenue, what happens, what are some of the issues that people have to pay attention to? What do they have to be careful about so that something bad doesn't happen along this corridor?
I think people kind of move towards that way. I mean, right in that fire station area across the street, new construction, we were talking about 2-story townhouses, and they build them to the street. They kind of know what works. I think those have always been popular, those townhouses. It seemed like they sold really quickly. So I think that a lot of people know that kind of keeping the flavor of the street, continuing this as even a walking area.
One thing I discovered in the plan that some folks did a few years ago, and we're going to talk with some of the authors of that later, was that technically Hennepin Avenue is underbuilt. It could actually, there could be higher rise.
You mean zoning?
Yeah, the zoning would allow for people to take down some of these things and put up ungodly things. How would the city address that?
I'm hoping, I think the new zoning code is completed, a lot of it now, and I think that they are looking and trying to guide new development more. I mean, the zoning code was from the 60s, so I think they realized that looking at especially a lot of these urban areas, residential versus retail areas, that some of those things need to be protected, that if this has always been kind of a 2-story area, that maybe keep the heights down. A lot of that is being changed, I think.
Does keeping the sense of a corridor like this with these wonderful old buildings and then reusing some of them, for better or worse, does that become a marketing opportunity for a city or a community? How can they?
Don't you think so? This
how can
area,
they use that? Yeah.
This area is
keep it vital.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think it is vital. I think that zoning kind of works towards that and realizes that we don't want this to become a land of parking lots, that this area is really surrounded by a lot of apartment uses, and that kind of plays off of the walking community.
And the whole land use question there in terms of how the urban design goes into new opportunities and things like that. You're a traveled woman. Would you compare this stretch of Minneapolis, the South Hennepin, Uptown area, to any place else that you're familiar with?
Oh, interesting.
I sometimes,
there is
and I'll
an
go out on
area
a limb.
in my hometown.
Oh, in your
that's
hometown.
Like this.
Now, where is your hometown?
I'm from Lexington, Kentucky, and the area is called Chevy Chase, and it's all 1-2-story, no parking really, and it doesn't really hurt the community around it too much. I think there's not a lot of parking on the side streets, but it's vibrant with the florist and the dry cleaner, but they still have the trendy shops and the new plate restaurants coming in.
And people are coming in with contemporary uses and that sort of thing. When the streetcars were coming in here, obviously they were picking up an awful lot of people, dropping off a lot of people. So transportation's always been part of this corridor. And for something we researched, there are, I forget how many thousands of cars or vehicles of different types that use this corridor. How important is it to a corridor to buffer that kind of a situation with transportation? You mentioned the parking, and obviously we don't want that jamming up against some of these beautiful buildings. Transportation a big problem for preservationists?
Sure.
Yeah.
Transportation and therefore the parking lots are a huge issue, especially downtown.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of the way it is. We work with it.
You have to adapt to it.
Yeah, I mean, this always was a heavy-duty transportation area, though.
Right.
I mean, I think we have to kind of remember that before cars, it still was pretty busy.
Right, and in some ways that's what developed this area.
I think the thing you worry about are street widenings and things like that. It'd be pretty hard on Hennepin.
From a city's point of view, when these kind of issues come up, there are people that care passionately about preservation. There's a commercial connection here where people may be concerned about preservation, but at the same time, they've got to do business. Then you've got a public works concept here, and indeed, as we're sitting here talking, that bottleneck area once again is being renewed and redone. How does the city come together in its different facets to talk about this? Is there some large committee that's put together, or is it kind of catch as catch can?
That's interesting. I think the city, even since I've been here in the past 5 years, has worked hard to bring in everyone and to get that out in the open. And I think when you do that, you work better together. I know that Hennepin Avenue Methodist Church was really involved and held some of the meetings there because their church would be hurt.
So
the streets would be closed.
as a private sector entity,
yeah, I think
they
the
were a
city
party
does
to that.
work hard to kind of keep it open and figure out. And sometimes they do get some kind of new, interesting ways to work around it. And
some fresh ideas
someone
maybe
might say
pop up.
something about meters and where to put parking meters and things like that. Yeah.
So it can kind of bubble up where it can come from more of a coordinated effort and people work on it together.
Works better if it's coordinated.
Okay. Yeah, it would, wouldn't it? That's right. Well, Amy Lucas, I want to thank you very much for being on the show. Pleasure to have you here.
Thanks.
That's great. Well, now, next up, we're going to be talking about strategic planning and how some folks from the community here in the business sector and neighbors put their best efforts together to come up with a plan for South Hennepin Avenue. But first, as we always do on Inside Minneapolis, we'd like to have somebody tell us a little bit about the place that we're taping. So let's go to Melissa Marcotte Freeland, who's with Calhoun Square.
Thanks, Phil. I'm Melissa Marcotte. I'm the marketing manager of Calhoun Square. And Calhoun Square is a retail and entertainment complex that opened 15 years ago in the heart of Uptown Minneapolis. We're fortunate to have some of the original businesses still here in Calhoun Square, including Greffen Jewelers, Filio, Cafte, which has since turned into Cravings Uptown, and a host of others.
Like we're in your office, just chattering away. So thanks for being here. This is great. Well, we want to thank Melissa and the good folks, a lot of good folks here at Calhoun Square for inviting us in. It's always nice to be on location. And you are watching Inside Minneapolis. Now, my next guests were instrumental in putting together a strategic plan, the Hennepin Avenue Strategic Plan, as a matter of fact. Marjorie Pitz is with Martin and Pitz Associates. Marjorie, it's nice to have you here.
Nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure. And Suzanne Zorn, nice to see you. Suzanne and I go back a ways. We served on Q for a number of years.
Yes.
And the moniker I would use to describe you is an urban environmentalist, an activist of different types, but that one in particular. So nice to have you here. And I do have this, I'm not sure which camera we're going to get here, the strategic plan, which you folks both worked on, published in what, 95?
Yes.
But it took a while before that with the hard work on the committee. Suzanne, could you just walk us through the origins of this plan, where the idea came from?
Yes. The idea came from citizens around who were worried about the fate of Hennepin Avenue and had been for about 20 years. First, they were worried that it was going to become a high-rise canyon, and then after a little bit, the styles changed, and we were all worried about its becoming mini malls and curb cuts and losing whatever charm it had.
Well, now, let me just interrupt there because you just brought up something that we talked about earlier in the show, and that is that in a sense, in a technical sense, according to zoning opportunities, Hennepin Ave, this corridor is sort of underbuilt. In other words, if they wanted to, they really could be putting up those high rises. Is that right?
Well, there were citizen protests about these, and we failed. The one on Douglas and Hennepin went up despite citizen protests.
Well, that was the early 80s or mid 80s, something? Is that where the Christian Science reading room is? Am I thinking the same one?
No, it's at Douglas, which
at Douglas.
is nearer the Walker than what you're
saying. Okay, a little further. There.
Yeah,
okay. I know the one you mean.
And
right
it's
on
very
that. Yeah, that was a little more recent. Yeah.
That was one. I don't want to say that fear was our only motivation, but it was a big one.
It concentrated the attention, seeing that one go up.
Yeah, and fears of all the mini malls. The one at 26th and Hennepin, which is a small mini mall with a dentist and a bank, and was maybe the final blow. And
there had been
stirred a lot of people.
An auto dealership or
that
parts.
was sort of a derelict building,
and it'd been vacant
which
for
they
a while.
took. That's right, and it wasn't worth. It couldn't be rehabbed.
Right.
Anyway, that the mini mall would appear there too, in addition to the other ones on Hennepin.
And you didn't want to see this sort
was
of
very bad.
down the street with more of these.
So fear was
that was
one of the motivators. The others were many people's realization that streets are your defining public places in cities anymore. We don't have large plazas, we don't build cities that way, but the streets define how you feel about your city. Mm-hmm. And we thought it was crucial that that we take care of our streets. Another motivator was CUE, the city's Committee on the Urban Environment, had a corridors conference in '92, which triggered a lot of street attention throughout the city.
Yeah, numerous corridors.
Central Avenue, Nicollet, and Hennepin were three of them. And that was a very successful conference, and I think it fostered lots of interest throughout the city. In addition, there is a book by a person named Alan Jacobs called Great Streets, where he discusses what makes a street great and uses examples throughout the world. Boulevard Saint-Michel in Paris would be a great street, and the Ramblas in Barcelona are two famous examples that
Sure,
most
world
people
class,
know.
absolutely.
And he analyzes what makes them great. Primarily, it is activity and trees. Trees not only softening buildings, but shedding a light that is various and interesting.
Sure.
And many other things.
I'm
too.
sure. And then in good Minneapolis fashion, a number of people came to the table. And can you just sort of by category, who came? Obviously people that lived in the neighborhood, other parties?
We put together a task force of neighborhood people, 6 neighborhoods along Hennepin Avenue from the Basilica to the cemetery. That is Loring and Lena, Lowry Hill East and Carrig, and Lowry Hill and East Isles and Echo, and then Sidna, which is over west farther, but cares about Hennepin and
Very
cares
much so.
about these matters, joined too. So we had people from 7 neighborhoods. We also felt it was important to have business people because they have to be behind this, because Hennepin is a business strip.
It's a commercial strip.
And we don't want to do anything that they're going to be against. Their instincts were maybe not to have too many trees to block, so that you don't see, so that you might not see their signs.
Right.
And
You want people to be able to see where
that's
to go
right.
and do business.
That's right.
Yeah.
Downtown, Saks Fifth Avenue objected to the trees in front of their building on Nicollet Mall.
Right.
So you have to, it was an education process for them and also for the neighborhood people to hear their concerns. The future of this plan depends very much on the business people, because they will need to establish a service district by which you are able to assess the businesses. So the businesses
And
have
raise
to
some
agree
funds
to that.
implement some of the
Also,
goals.
each neighborhood has contributed some of its NRP money. Do we assume you know what
Well, we should mention
NRP
an
is?
NRP as a bureaucracy and as a citizen participation effort.
And a neighborhood revitalization is what it is. So the neighborhoods have NRP committees with allotted funds to each one, and it has turned out, by now, it's taken along many years, each neighborhood has allotted a nice amount to Hennepin Avenue from
Right.
their NRP funds. So everything's done except the business
Okay, so
service
that's the next
district,
piece.
and that's the next piece.
Now, once you've assembled these people and some discussions happen, and I understand you already had sort of defined the area you wanted to study, you brought in some consultants, among them Marjorie,
Yeah.
and your firm.
Martin and Pitz Associates.
That's right. Oh, briefly describe to our viewers what Martin and Pitz does, so people know what you brought to the table.
We're a landscape architecture firm, and we do urban design and master planning as well. And we concentrate mostly on public spaces in the
And you've been
cities.
involved in a number of projects throughout the area.
Right,
So you brought
right.
that kind of wisdom to this as well and experience. If you would, you were kind enough to bring an image here of, I guess what you call kind of the project area here,
Right.
the area you were studying. And could you briefly walk us through what to me is very interesting? Basically, you took the core that Suzanne was describing and kind of broke it up into sub-districts. Can you just walk our viewers through that?
Sure. One of the things that's really fascinating about Hennepin is it has such a diversity of character along its way. And we started at the Basilica, and there's a special character to the Loring area. Then there's this transitional area where the interchange happens with I-94. Then there's a zone that we call the Triangle and Grid District, where Hennepin slices on a diagonal to the grid lines of the blocks. And this diagonal creates a lot of triangular corners and really interesting and unique architectural opportunities.
And as you're implying, that's one of the few places in the city where the grid is really interrupted and very dramatically.
It's very dramatic.
Yeah.
You get very narrow pointed blocks coming at you, and there's some very special architecture that can happen and that it still exists because of those opportunities with the different angles.
Right.
Then there's the famous Lake and Hennepin Uptown Zone, which has its own unique character. And finally, before it gets to the cemetery, Lakewood Cemetery, there's a neighborhood district that again has its own unique character.
And just by point of fact here, along that residential area, right along Hennepin, there's a fair amount of commercial activity in there. I guess the zoning allows that to happen.
Well, they were very concerned about the transition from residential to commercial, so that was part of the study.
And that's an ongoing discussion, I know. I don't think a year goes by, but there isn't somebody saying, we could just put our shop here, and the neighbors have something to say, and the local council member says, well, let's sort that out. I think that's an ongoing situation.
Yeah, it's a struggle.
Well, other than the fact that it was kind of interesting to find the distinctness and the character that you found, were there any big surprises that you found as you studied this area, something that you'd never thought you'd encounter on South Hennepin Avenue?
To me, one of the most interesting was the triangle and grid district. Because of the different angles that people can choose to align their building edges to, modern buildings in mini-mall plans tend to be rectangular boxes. So when they try to fit those into these angled streets, they left lots of open space and put their parking up against the diagonals so they could keep their buildings square with the grid. But that made corners empty, and it doesn't bring the street vitality and the wall of activity right up to the sidewalks, which is what characterizes Hennepin so well.
I think we were talking earlier that in at least one case it became a place where some billboards clustered. It was just an opportunity to make a little money, I suppose, and put up a few pillars and run some billboards.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of wasted areas in these triangles that really have special opportunities.
Now, I know that a document like this is written really with the help of numerous people, so I'm not sure who the author of this was, but it was described in here that this area really is one of the most imageable corridors of any of Minneapolis's corridors. Can we talk a little bit about that? What do we mean by being imageable?
I think that imageable means that you can imagine what it looks like and retain a memory of a place. That it isn't just like every other street in America, which tends to just be bland. And so Hennepin Avenue in its different areas does have places that have very strong images that'll stay in people's memory, and that makes it a special place.
Okay. Well, you have, unfortunately, just a minute left. I wanted to ask quickly about some of the opportunities and the next steps. What are some of the biggest opportunities or challenges for this stretch from a point of view that like you might have with your urban design?
I think there's the challenge of commercial and residential. They both need each other, and they both sometimes can be at odds for parking versus pedestrian space, and so they need to walk that tightrope and keep the vitality and still honor each other's needs. So that's an ongoing thing. Lighting is really an important thing that has never happened on Hennepin Avenue. It's all borrowed light from businesses and telephone poles that have papers plastered all over them. There is no lighting standard except in the uptown area.
Yeah, that would be significant there.
Right.
And very briefly, Suzanne, next step for the citizens in the area, what are you working on, the Special Service District?
That's next.
That's front and center.
The citizens have sort of done their part with their NRP funds, and the next is doing it.
Okay.
The Lindale-Hennepin interchange was recommended in
this, and as we sit here, that work is going on and informed
and that
to some extent.
Comes from here.
Yeah.
Comes from the plan. It also, according to Mike Monahan, the previous head of Public Works, they had that in their heads too, and he said, great minds work alike. So they grabbed onto this right away.
So you've already seen some
that is
effect.
a result.
Yeah.
The plantings around there, they will gain some green space there, and the park board is helping us do some plantings there.
Well, I want to thank you both very much. We just touched the surface on this, but Marjorie, a pleasure to have you here.
Nice to be
here. And continued good luck. Keep the work going.
Yes.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Now, next up, we are going to talk with some folks that are part of the commercial fabric here along the Uptown area and South Hennepin Avenue. So stay tuned. But first we're going to take a look at a wonderful piece of video that our crew put together looking at people out and about on Hennepin today.
The Hennepin Lake area has just got a lot to offer everyone from the city, the suburbs, and out of state. It's just such a diverse group of shops and people. They just come to have fun.
Probably just because of the combination of stores and restaurants. I think in the lakes. The lakes brings a lot of people here.
Because it goes through all the major points of Minneapolis. It goes through downtown and uptown, and so many of the bus lines run on it. I mean, that's basically why I'm on it so much, just because of bus lines. This is where everything seems to be.
Probably the diversity of people up here and the shops.
And I know one of his press people, and they said, great idea, and then he's going to watch it himself. Well, anyhow, what we just saw was a nice piece of video. Nice work, Stephanie and John, taking a look at the vitality of South Hennepin Avenue right now, out and about on Hennepin Avenue. And right now, we're going to talk a little bit about commercial activity along this corridor, and with me is a woman who knows a lot about that, Cindy Fitzpatrick.
Hi, Phil.
Pleasure to have you here.
Great.
And you head up the Uptown Association.
Yes, I do. The Uptown Association is the commercial district. The boundaries are from 28th on Hennepin to 31st, and from the lake to DuPont. So
which coincidentally are almost exactly the boundaries of the Uptown Art Fair.
It's, imagine that.
Right now, as we're sitting here talking, it's not that long back that you just survived that. How'd it go this year?
It was great this year. We tried some new things. One of the new things we did is do park and rides with Metro Transit.
Actually, that program was pretty impressive. You were in what, 2 or 3 locations?
2 locations, and we had 12,000 riders for a first-time event of trying this. We're very excited. Hopefully, we will go out to some of the outskirts and bring more of the suburban people back into the city for the Uptown Art Fair.
And one of the things about the Uptown Art Fair is that it is literally one of the largest events of its type. What's the number, round number, that you guys...
In terms of
people that show up?
About 400,000.
400,000 in a 3-day period?
In a 3-day period, and we are... we have 20th in the nation for art fairs in terms of prestige of artists and quality.
Okay. So that's on sort of the aesthetic side of it. Well, that's pretty good considering the, what, million or so that are out there.
Yes, and we bring in people from 43 states this year, Canada.
Presenters,
artists,
you're talking about.
So
how many presenters are there?
There are about 525.
525. That's a pretty good ratio then of visitors of the 400,000. That's grown since I last knew.
Yeah, this year was a bigger year, a little bit bigger, and I think because of the construction that was on Hennepin and Lyndale, we had the opportunity to try the park and rides.
Oh, that was a good, yeah, because one was down by Dunwoody, wasn't it? That was one area there?
And it really worked well. It's a great way to show off this area, which is a little bit different part of the city.
Absolutely. And it's a very urban part of the city, and we were talking a little earlier about that and what it means to folks. I want you to share with me what you're saying about the impressions that people have when they come here from other, shall we just say, very urban parts of the country.
Yeah, it's always interesting. I'll get calls from people who've been transplanted for work, and they'll say, oh, I'm so excited I found Uptown. It's the most big city part of Minneapolis that I found with the diversity. Northwest Travel Magazine wrote, it's a place you can see pink-haired dreadlocks next to Betty Crocker lookalikes, next to women with the hugest diamonds, and it's Uptown, nobody cares, and everybody's welcomed here.
Well, it is really kind of a melting pot in that regard, isn't it?
It is.
Just to backtrack half a step about the art fair, which is hugely successful, I think, in just about any way you'd want to characterize it. I've just got to ask, what's the wear and tear? And I don't mean on the staff that have to do this, but with that many people in there, what does that do to the infrastructure here? Or does it have the capacity to just handle that? I mean, do you have to fix things up afterwards?
We don't do that much fixing up. We do a real good job of keeping everything clean and getting the area ready. What it does for the area, it brings in the funding that we use to do a lot of different things. Uptown is a little bit different from some of the other commercial nodes. We take on and we pay for our electricity, the little black pedestrian lights that you see through Uptown to make it lighter. That's our responsibility to pay for it. It's not our building owners. They're not taxed on that. We do a clean of the streets. We hire more beat cops during the summer months when we're busier for that safety feeling.
Right.
We do some promotions. We oversee how we do the snow removal, and if you've noticed, Uptown always has the best sidewalks in the winter.
From storefront to curb, it's there. Oh,
you can walk. You don't have to go over any mounds or winthrops at all, and we're very proud of that. And to do that, we have to do the Uptown Art Fair.
Right.
So we have the funding. So people have, it's kind of a different group that comes in for 3 days, and it's our Academy Awards to showcase it. And then we know that it's going to help us the whole next year to keep our level.
And it's very good natured. And I would also say, as a nearby resident, that as I come through, even the very next Monday, basically the cleanup is well underway.
It should be completed by Monday at noon.
Is that right?
Yes.
That's impressive. That's
well, it's just kind of what we promised. And we work with all the agencies that we hire and vendors, and we use some committee members and community service people, and that's our goal. So when you come out Monday, you don't even know the Uptown Art Fair was here.
Because it's another business day.
Yes, it is.
For your people. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the mix that's here that you represent with the Uptown Association, just in terms of the kinds of businesses and activities that are going on here from a commercial point of view.
We have a little bit of everything. We have, retail specialty stores, we have home furnishings, we have professional services, we have corporations, banks. We have everything you really would want, and I think that's one of the desires to live in this neighborhood, because everything's there that you would need, from an ATM to a tailor to a kitchen store to great places to eat.
To St. Sabrina's.
St. Sabrina's, to Isle Bun and Coffee, to everything. So it's all under one roof, and it is, and the lakes and the trails for those summer months.
Yeah, as we've seen on a couple of maps earlier, this is really a great intersection for a crossroads for the city in many ways. In fact, you have a map here. Maybe we can hold this up. This is your brochure on the Uptown Association. Let me hold this up here to Jean. And this is basically the, I guess you call it the service area.
It's the service area.
Of the Uptown Association. And it's really dynamic. There's been a lot of infill in the last number of years. I'm thinking like the Landmark Theaters and some of the restaurants that are over there on Lagoon.
Yes.
And there's sort of more coming, isn't there?
There's lots more coming. We're going to have Cinema Grill coming in. There's a new Persoli restaurant coming in the old Rainbow Building. Then with the Greenway coming in, the biking trails. It's just
now that's an exciting
changing.
connection there. Yeah, that's
constantly.
kind of. We've talked about that in an earlier show. That Greenway is going to be extending from the city limits to the west, right through Uptown, all the way over to the river. So another nice link for bicyclists, pedestrians, and what have you.
Everything, and
That's
just to make it more user and city friendly will be great.
You mentioned something I did not know, that this area pioneered some special service districting, or at least the concept of it. Can you fill in a little bit for me there?
The members of the Uptown Association are very particular about what and how everything's maintained. And they were trying to figure a way, one is snow removal, of how we can get that so everyone has to pitch in and do their share, because in some of the other city areas you have one building who shovels, the next doesn't, and it just doesn't look the greatest for your customers, your clients, or anyone coming into town.
It can be a little off-putting if you have an experience, maybe not with your given shop, but 2 doors down, it was a little tricky, and you might think twice the next time of making that trip.
Yes,
You
and
know.
so what they did in the 70s, late 70s, is they went and wrote legislature to form special service districts, which puts the taxing back on the business owner for certain things that they can do. And we were the first in the kind in the city to do it. And we have chosen just to let it be taxed on our snow plowing is one of the things that we do that, but we manage it internally from here with the city operators of helping us find the right vendors.
So at that level, on the operational level, there's a nice partnership between you folks here and the city.
And the contractor.
And then the contractor who actually has to do that. Well, that's great. We talked earlier about some of the demographic shifts that you've noticed, and I guess this is my part of the show where I like to ask about trends and things. And you mentioned that when folks come in from other parts of the country, they can see everything from, what do they call it, the metal in the cheek types to the rocks on the fingers. Tied in with that, though, you said you've noticed some changes over the last few years in terms of the clientele that's coming and maybe then some of the businesses that are serving them?
Well, you'll notice when you come into Uptown, if you come during the day, it's going to be a little younger generation. And then as the evening comes into the eating and dining, and especially on the weekends, it's going to be the 40-year-olds and over generation hanging out, eating, and doing the entertaining and dining. I always tell someone who's looking at a business, I tell them come in at noon, come back at 5, and then come back on a Thursday and Friday, and you're going to see a totally different group of people.
Right.
And so it always is changing, and a little bit we aren't as busy during the morning hours, but you drive here at 4 o'clock during the summer through the fall, it's packed every night with outdoor seating, different movies, with the Blair Witch Project that was just here this summer.
Yes.
That just brought a whole other group of people in and was really a great
Well, so
welcoming.
that was
for Uptown.
noticeable, that the Blair Witch Project actually brought in kind of a different crowd?
Yeah, different
for that particular
crowd,
one?
and we were busy during Monday through Friday during the day. Lines were starting at noon around the blocks.
Yep, I saw them snaking around there, and of course there used to be the Rocky Horror Picture Show that had, are they still running that here?
No, they aren't.
I think they went over to the Riverview or
I don't
something,
know
but
where
for
it is.
years, I think I saw it when I was a young man and then I was a middle-aged man, and they were still running that. So movies have always been important to this part of town.
It is. We're one of the areas that has still 3 theaters within spitting distance of each other.
And with the lagoon, multiple
theaters.
screens.
Yeah. And we've been able to make it work.
That's great.
A little bit different from downtown. So
Sure. And it is a nice destination here for people to come here if downtown's one experience they want, or the riverfront, and then they might want to come up and see Uptown.
And there is parking here. There's this mystique that there isn't, but there are parking lots and there is parking available.
Well, and as we showed an image earlier of the Calhoun Public School, which was closed and torn down, and right behind where we're sitting here, there's, I don't know how many stalls are there, but a large parking ramp right off the street there.
There's one there, and there's one over by the lagoon. There's one down behind the Rainbow Building. There is plenty of parking.
Yeah.
And plus, it's a great trip on the bus, too.
Now, the nature of this show, and we just have a moment left here, is we're talking about a corridor here that really, in this particular edition, we're talking about a corridor from down near Loring Park all the way down to Lakewood Cemetery, and I know your purview is really right here in the Uptown area. Is it your impression, though, that the success of Uptown has gone beyond its own limits, its own borders, and is going towards Lyndale and maybe carries along South Hennepin?
I think we're expanding the districts, and we're working better as a partnership together, because competition isn't horrible. It just makes the whole area thrive, and to do that we are working better, and it is going to be the avenue will
nice
be from the start.
synergy.
Yep, all
That's
the way
great.
down.
Cindy Fitzpatrick, thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks
nice
for
to have
having
you
me.
on the show. Now, we're going to come back in a moment to wrap up the whole show, but first, let's go and see what some of the wrong answers were to our monthly Who the Heck Is That? You saw the statue earlier. Let's find out what some people out on the street thought that statue was all about.
Bill Clinton.
I have no clue, so I'm gonna take a guess and think maybe it was some old soldier that lived in Minnesota.
Winston Churchill.
Well, I really don't know, but I would guess it's a founder of our fair city or something. But I don't know any names.
Can I ask questions about it?
It looks kind of like Jesse Ventura.
Is it somewhere in Minneapolis? Well, of course it is. It's inside Minneapolis. Is it the cemetery over off of, is it at the cemetery?
Don't have a clue.
Was he a politician?
James Hill.
Gosh. Well, he's from the area. That's very, because he has a coat. I mean, he's holding his coat. It's a beard. I have no idea.
Some governor? I don't know.
Well, always interesting to hear people's answers to that, and none of those were right. Let's go to Russell Olson, who does know the right answer.
Thank you, Phil. I'm Russell Olson, electric railway historian. The statue behind me is of Thomas Lowry. He came to Minneapolis in 1867 as a young lawyer, and there wasn't enough legal business to keep him occupied, so he branched off into real estate, became a very successful real estate developer. He bought 7 acres of land at Hennepin and Groveland where the North American Life Insurance Company, Walker Arts Center, and the Guthrie Theater are now located, and built a mansion on the property. By 1875, he became interested in public transportation for his housing development, real estate development projects, and formed the Minneapolis Street Railway, which built the first horse car lines in Minneapolis. In 1883, he acquired control of the St. Paul City Railway, which also involved the horse car lines in St. Paul. They converted to electric streetcars in 1890 and 1891, and to secure financing for the improvement, he formed the Twin City Rapid Transit Company. This became the owner of the huge transit system in Minneapolis and St. Paul, that at its peak had 524 miles of track, 1,100 streetcars, and reached Stillwater in the east and Lake Minnetonka on the west. He died in 1909 from tuberculosis, and they erected a statue of him at Hennepin and Lyndale, at the old bottleneck. When the Interstate 94, the freeway went through, that of course was all destroyed, and was moved here to Triangle Park at 24th and Hennepin.
Well, thank you, Russell. Good to know. Now, next month on Inside Minneapolis, we're going to take a look at another corridor in Minneapolis, the east end of Franklin Avenue. That's in the Seward neighborhood. And as usual, at the end of this show, we'll have our catalog of resources, so get your paper and pencil out. Paired with that is a wonderful image taken from the roof of the Plaza Hotel, looking south along the bottleneck portion of the Hennepin Avenue corridor. And next to the credits at the end of the show is an image of West High School. No longer exists. It was torn down in 1982. Now, if you want to call with comments about the show, call our City Cable 34 hotline, 673-2234. And we do have a website you can contact, and on that is a lot of information about the show, some background about it, not least of which is a little information about some road shows that the new executive director of the MCDA is going to be going on later this month. And you can find out the where and the what's and the specifics to that. Well, I'm Phill Lindsay. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Inside Minneapolis. We'll see you next time.